Probing the Megalithic Mind in Malta, presented by Peter Lloyd. In this lecture, Peter presented an introduction to the Megalithic Temples of Malta and recent research specific to Malta and new theories and disciplines in that country relating to ethnogens and acoustics. Recorded live at Megalithomania Conference 2007.
Thanks. I'm Peter Lloyd, and this talk is about the megalithic minds, about the mindset and possible worldviews of the people who built the megalithic temples and what they used them for, with particular reference to Malta. This is in Malta, it's the Haggarium Temple. Malta's got the oldest of the more built-up temples. In the Guinness Book of Records, the Gigantea Temple is described as being the oldest freestanding structure in the world. It's about 1,000 years older than Stonehenge. It's not quite the oldest megalithic structure, which I believe is in the Napta Playa, but rather than being a ring of stones, a circle of stones, it actually is a constructed edifice. We're never really going to fully understand the mindset and worldview of the Neolithic people, but we can follow certain vectors or approaches into their way of thinking. The traditional way of thinking is to look at the archaeological artifacts. Things dug up in the ground, how people are buried. This is rather limited because it doesn't necessarily give you much insight into how things were used, only what materials people had to use in temples. There are three more recent branches of archaeology: archaeoacoustics, archaeoastronomy, and archaeopharmacology, which look at particular new vectors into what people were doing in the temples. Archaeoacoustics is looking at resonances within megalithic chambers, looking at echoes and how those relate to artistic records within the temples to indicate that people were aware of our acoustic features and may have been using certain chanting methods inside the temples. Archaeoastronomy is, keep pressing the wrong button, is looking at alignments of the temples with the rising and setting sun and the moon and possibly other astronomical phenomena. Archaeopharmacology is a new field which looks at tiny microscopic samples from artifacts dug out of the ground to look for, in particular, narcotics. The chap called Brendan Burhan in Newcastle upon Tyne, looking at hashish and other narcotics which may be found in tiny samples, which is a way of confirming whether or not the Neolithic people were using any kind of entheogens or hallucinogenic plants. There was a report back in the 1990s that there were findings of henbane seeds in a cookery pot in Scotland, which immediately led people to think that they were using henbane as a means of having trips. It gives a sensation of lightness and flight, but subsequent analysis indicated that probably it wasn't henbane seeds at all, but the story still goes around in the literature. There are other ways of approaching other vectors into the megalithic mind based upon things happening we can record today. For example, present-day shamanic practices. It's most hunter-gatherer tribes, communities around the world use shamanic methods. It's likely that Paleolithic people use them, and probably the Neolithic as well. We can look at the effects of entheogens, hallucinogenic plants today, to see what kind of artistic creations come about through people using and having psychedelic visions. We can look at the visual form constants and look at some of the neurological explanations for what people see in visionary art. I make a particular reference to Malta because I happen to be there, but also it's as I said, one of the oldest collections. It's a very rich collection of megalithic structures. They go back to 6,000 years ago. And this is the Menidra temple complex, which faces towards the rising sun, so that in the winter solstice, the sun aligns with the side stones. In the summer solstice, it aligns with the ones on the other side, and the equinox, the sun goes right up the middle. So almost all the temples are structured like this in Malta. They used to be taller, about twice the height of these. and with roofs on. So they were very dark chambers within which the rising sun would be very effective inside the inner temples. But sadly in Malta there has been a lack of historical respect for the temples. A lot of stones were taken and stolen. More recently there have been attacks on the Megalithomania temple complex. There's been a lot of controversy between the government and the bird hunting community, and one of their forms of protest is to wreck megalithic temples. About 60 stones were knocked out of the Megalithomania temple and broken, and it's all a bit sad. But that had a shock effect on the Maltese government of trying now to preserve them, putting fences around, bringing in security, which in itself actually has an adverse knock-on effect. During the 70s and 80s, there was a lot of interest in the goddess cult within Malta, and a lot of people went on goddess trips and performed rituals and ceremonies in the temples. That's all ended now. It's deemed to be profaning the temples to carry out any kind of ceremony. So you can go and sit and meditate, but you can't chant, use candles, pour any liquids into libation holes. So the security is improved, but also it excludes what one might regard as a neo-pagan use of the temples. This particular circle is in Gozo, an island to the north of Malta, which, if you look in the guidebooks, will tell you there's not much to see, but it's been quite useful to archaeologists, which is a bit of an understatement. The actual circle itself used to be quite large, about 50 stones. During the course of the 19th century, it was dug up, and the excavation had to stop abruptly because the landowner believed that the archaeologists at the time were looking for buried treasure and were going to just run away with it. So they had to stop the excavation, fill in the hole that they dug, and over the subsequent century, it was forgotten about. The stones were removed, 48 of the stones were taken away, used for building somewhere else, and people just forgot the temple even existed, until this chap, Joe Taboni, rediscovered the circle. He was a bird hunter, and he knew that part of Gozo very, very well. He knew every nook and cranny. He was aware that there were these stones, and one day he came across this painting, realized that there ought to be something still there, and used his local knowledge to rediscover the Brockdorf circle. And he reported this to the authorities, who came round and poked around and said, yes, okay, we'll add it to the textbooks. There is a stone circle in Gozo. What wasn't so clear is that there was actually an underground temple within the stone circle. Nothing much happened from 1950s to 85, when there was a conference on archaeology in the Mediterranean area in Malta, and Joe Taboni went along as an amateur archaeologist and said, well, you really ought to go and have a look at this circle, the Brockdorf circle. They went along in 85, became very excited, and in 1987, two Cambridge archaeologists, Caroline Malone and Simon Stoddart, started excavating it. They took about 7 years to excavate it, and there was a huge amount of material still preserved, because about 2000 BC, the roof collapsed on the underground temple, preserving the positions of all the items, all the artifacts, all the buried bodies. Nothing had been ravaged. There's one small area that had been dug up in the 1828 excavation, but the rest of it was still in excellent condition. And once they'd removed the collapsed roof, they were able to have access to absolute Aladdin's cave of materials. And they recorded the positions of everything very precisely. There were about 200,000 body parts from 800 skeletons and huge numbers of artifacts. The publication of this was coming out at the end of this year, hopefully, and Simon Stoddart and Caroline Malone will be talking at the conference in November. It's probably going to revolutionize our understanding of temple culture and temple activities in Malta. From the database of all the artifacts, they've created a virtual reality. This work's been done in Bristol University to recreate a visual image of how the temple used to look under the ground. Only the first level has been excavated. There's another underground temple, the Hypogeum of Halsaflieni, in the middle of Malta, which goes down 3 levels. And it may well be this goes down to a similar depth. But they ran out of money, and excavation has ceased in 1994. If they get some more money, they'll carry on and may discover further layers of the underground temple. what this phenomenal database of information reveals is a lot about the materials used in the temples, the statuettes, the various devices they used, and also a lot of regularities. For example, at each altar place, there'd be a bowl of water on one side and a fireplace on the other, indicating that these things are deliberately placed in that particular pattern. But even though we have these records of the materials, of the instruments they use, the musical instruments, and all the divisions of the temple by means of portholes and steps and thresholds, and little oracle holes where people would speak or give offerings to, there's still a central question of why they built the megalithic temples. One part of that answer is just the sheer mechanics of building a large structure without mortar or cement. You want to have a large building that doesn't fall down, so it makes sense to use large stones, megaliths. But using large stones isn't easy. It's required a huge effort for anyone to build a megalithic structure, and this particular community, which had no metal tools to cut into the stone, had no wheels to transport it, would have required a huge effort. The underground temple, which is in Haggarium, this is the one that was carved out of the living rock. These aren't stones put in, these are actually carved into the rock. Again, carved with bones and stones, it would have required an immense effort, probably going over several generations. This is the layout of the underground temple. You can see there are many different chambers. That's just one level. It goes down 3 levels. And the question of why people would be spending years, decades, possibly generations in damp, very wet, cramped tunnels, digging away, excavating this beautiful, acoustically perfect chamber is a question which is curious. It was a small community, certainly less than 10,000 people living in Malta, and survival would have been uppermost in their mind, how to survive the winter with whatever crops they managed to harvest in any given year. So it's a big question of why people whose main focus is just to survive would actually invest a huge effort into building something which has no apparent utilitarian purpose. There must have been a very powerful experience that people had in the temples in order to motivate them to carry on working for decades and possibly generations. And the small island of Malta wouldn't have had a deeply structured society. There were no kings, there was no standing army. In fact, there are no archaeological finds of any weapons in Malta in the Neolithic period. It was a peaceful society. People wouldn't have been whipped into line to build the temples. Each person must have had a sense of being a stakeholder in the enterprise of building megalithic temples. So there must have been a really powerful, extraordinary experience that they gained from the use of the temples. And one thing which comes to mind as a possibility is the phenomenon of altered states of consciousness. If people are taken out of their normal lives into possibly another realm of experience, perhaps another spiritual realm, another realm of reality, that might be the kind of thing which would motivate people to actually invest a huge effort into building the temples. Well, that's a plausible hypothesis, but what evidence is there? One line of evidence are the forms of art that are frequently found with great prominence in the temples, and they match visual form constants. These are visual phenomena which were originally discovered by Heinrich Klüver, which people experience when using hallucinogenic materials or entheogens. He originally studied it with peyote, but it's been similar forms have been confirmed with other hallucinogenic substances. But they play a huge role in the art of the temples in Malta, and indeed the megalithic art throughout the world. They're not simply there as decorations. They are the primary artistic manifestation on the stones in the temple, which suggests that they were important, that they were regarded as being a primary indicator of the function of the temples. But what they actually signify is another question. They're important, but what do they mean? Are they artifacts? Are they entopic phenomena? In other words, when people take hallucinogenic substance or go into a trance state through other means, is it simply that the brain, the architecture of the brain, is generating images because it's wired that way? Or are people actually encountering another realm, another spiritual reality? There are several ways in which people can go into trance states. Sensory deprivation, the darkness and deep silence inside the temples, acoustics, resonating sound around 110 hertz is known to put people into the relevant brain state, and breath work, self-induced hyperventilation, or hallucinogenic plants. Inside the temples, this is a artistic reconstruction of the Menidra temple complex, which shows that it's a large, completely dark space. There are no windows, one single entrance doorway. So inside, there would have been some fires, a very smoky atmosphere, a very dense, multisensory experience. The kind of place where people can shut off from the outside world. And undoubtedly, the Neolithic community would have been a very busy place, living in small, cramped quarters, very noisy, very busy. Going into the temple would be like going into an underground chamber. It would be a sensory deprived place. Archaeoacoustics. The work by Paul Devereux has shown that many of the megalithic tombs in England and Ireland have a resonance of 110 hertz, which is at the lower end of the male vocal range. And it's also known to change the brain state. The EEG recordings have indicated that it has a trance-inducing capacity. The resonances haven't been measured in Malta, but hoping that Paul will have access to them in November when he comes over to actually measure, especially in the underground temples of House of Fleini, what resonances there might be. Hyperventilation is another way in which people, even without access to hallucinogenic plants, can enter into trance states and go into visionary experiences with what may well be another universe. And then, of course, narcotics. South America is well known for its huge range of plants. Europe is less well endowed, but there are some known to be in Malta. Henbane is one hallucinogenic plant which grows wild in Malta. It creates a sensation of lightness and of flight. So we might imagine Neolithic people lying down inside their chambers in the darkness, perhaps ingesting some henbane and experiencing flight. It is, of course, an incredibly poisonous plant, which implies that if it was used, then the shamans, the priests of the community, would have been highly skilled people to administer a correct dosage. Obviously, another one is ergot, which might have been growing in their grain stores. One theory that's been put forward is that inside the underground chambers in House of Fleini, there are several steps going down and then a large apparent storage place. Maybe the grain was stored there and ergot reaped and used as part of the temple ceremonies. Of course, henbane was associated with Wicca, which has been suppressed along with henbane itself. Now, there's the question of whether hallucinogenic drugs or other forms of trance actually simply mess up the brain so you see a dysfunctional perception, or whether they give access to another world. One of the things which indicates that they may actually give access to other spiritual realms is the consistency of what is seen, and also the ideation. Ayahuasca, in particular, is a drug known to yield not only sensory perceptions, but also ideas. And the chap called Benny Shannon, who will be at the conference in November, who's done a lot of work on ayahuasca and other entheogens, which indicates strongly that a very frequently arising idea, a propositional state in the mind, is the notion that the world around us, the material world, is actually illusory. That we can enter into other realms which seem as real as this one, or more real, accompanied by the notion that what we take to be the physical world, the material world, is in some sense illusory, that it is simply a perception, a dream, driven by some spiritual entity. This is a philosophy which has been around a long time. Aldous Huxley coined the phrase the perennial philosophy because it keeps recurring throughout history. Just like in The Matrix is a very modern manifestation of the same notion. In the film The Matrix, people are plugged into a computer with a cable going to the back of their head, and all of their sense perceptions, what they see, what they hear, what they feel, what they taste, everything comes from the computer. It is synthetically generated. So this is a dramatic remanifestation of an ancient philosophy which can be traced back to the Vedantic tradition in India. Shankara was a scholar and guru who articulated the Vedic notions of reality in a very clear way, in which Brahman is considered to be the only ultimate reality, the consciousness of the universe. And each of us is a sheathed manifestation of that single consciousness. And what we take to be the material world that we perceive through our senses is a projection. We imaginatively project a material world outside of our sense perceptions. The Vedic religion was itself probably derived from hallucinogenic plants known as soma. In the West, George Berkeley, the Irish philosopher in the 18th century, is the clearest exponent of a theory that he called immaterialism. This again is the notion that what we take to be solid objects are actually constructs. We imagine that there are solid objects out in the world because our perceptions are easily modeled in that way. But there's no way to tell whether we are actually living a multi-channel hallucination or a lifelong dream, or if we're in the matrix. Anything you do, anything you touch, is going to give you a sense impression. So there's no way to tell if this is actually a physical material reality. And because there's no way to tell if this is a material world, the very concept of a material world is otiose, is redundant, and it's conceptually incoherent. If you can never actually test something, if in principle you can never reach out and access the material world, it's a vacuous concept. Now the question is, what worldview did the Neolithic people have? If they had access to other worlds, other visionary worlds through trance, and could move easily for shamanic purposes, for purposes of healing, into the other worlds, maybe they never burdened themselves with our modern concept of material reality. Maybe as far as they were concerned, the visionary worlds were every bit as real as the living worlds, the day-to-day worlds. And if so, they may well have had an idealistic philosophy, a worldview, the worldview of the perennial philosophy, in which everything is consciousness. Now, in the world of psychology, consciousness itself has been a taboo subject. You were allowed to study rats going around in mazes, you were allowed to study brain processes, but to study consciousness wasn't permitted until comparatively recently, possibly as a result of students who experimented with LSD and other psychotropic substances in the 60s, climbing up through the hierarchies of academia into positions where they could give funding for research projects. There's now a branch of academia called consciousness studies. There are regular conferences, academic journals studying the nature and structure of consciousness. Within this field, the old notion that there is a materiality and nothing else, that the brain is just a lump of stuff and no consciousness, it's an illusion, has more or less been disregarded as being intellectually bankrupt. But the question then is, how does mind, how does consciousness relate to the brain? The old story from René Descartes is that there are two different substances, a physical substance, the brain, and a mental substance, the mind. This is not a workable theory because of the impossibility of interconnecting something which has no position, which is just floating somewhere outside of space, and a physical object. So that there's a movement within consciousness studies towards what is called panpsychism. If the brain can't generate consciousness, if an unthinking, numb brain can't generate consciousness, then consciousness must be there at the base level. Every part of the brain, every particle, every atom must have some rudimentary spark of consciousness in it, so that when you bring together all the parts of the brain into a functioning living system, you have what we recognize as our stream of consciousness. Now, really, this is tantamount to idealism. Both panpsychism the idea that every atom has a tiny bit of consciousness, and idealism, that everything is consciousness, are essentially the same idea, but they differ in terms of their scale. That on the one hand, there's a notion that the atoms, the particles of consciousness, are micro, at a micro level, corresponding to microphysical things, and on the other hand, the notion that the elements of the mental world are large, are macroscopic minds like our own. So that when you have a table or a lectern, the consciousness corresponding to this physical object, according to idealism, is another mind. Whereas in panpsychism, each atom in the lectern corresponds to a tiny mind. So the two theories are very similar. Animism is a theory generally ascribed to Neolithic people. It's a notion that every object, every tree, every stream has a spirit, a consciousness. In a way, it is a hybrid between panpsychism and idealism, insofar as they recognize the tree, for example, has a mind, has a spirit, but also is still a physical tree. So it looks as if the Neolithic people may have been halfway between idealism and panpsychism. But we don't know because we can't go back and talk to them. It's very difficult to find a language in which to describe things that are so far outside of our day-to-day world. The language itself has evolved to talk about objects, bread, cheese, furniture. We don't have a built-in language to talk about the spiritual realm. Now, shamanism is one discipline which actively uses the spirit world, the visionary world. And it's widely found in hunter-gatherer societies around the world, so it probably existed in Paleolithic and probably inherited in Neolithic times. The core idea of shamanism is the notion that there is another reality different from the mundane reality, that it's possible to access it and solicit the assistance of entities, of beings existing in the spirit realm. And it's hard to imagine, as I was saying at the beginning, why the Neolithic people would have put so much effort into building the temples unless there was a very concrete and substantial benefit to them. It's therefore reasonable to suppose that some form of healing, some form of shamanism, some means of improving the fertility of their crops might have been the substantive and material benefit that people derived from the use of the temples. Now, the core idea of shamanism is excluded by the modern scientific view, which is that we are physical beings in a physical world. But it neatly fits in with the perennial philosophy, and so is another circumstantial pointer towards the idea that the Neolithic people were actually regarding themselves as existing within a world of consciousness. We have the manifest world, the day-to-day world, and another part of the realm of consciousness, which can be accessed through shamanism. Now, many people have what they call energy experiences at megalithic sites throughout the world, either directly by feeling it or through dowsing. One example within Malta was a particular chair which, when people sit on and tap in a certain way, often they feel a tremendous voltage going through them and out through the top of their head into the sky. But I would suggest that energy isn't the best concept, the best term to use to describe whatever phenomenon it is that is going on in megalithic structures. The so-called energy of megalithic structures doesn't respect the inverse square law, doesn't observe a law of conservation, it works non-locally and exhibits local intelligence. The same phenomenon seems to be involved in a lot of paranormal phenomenon. For example, in remote viewing, it's possible to remote view something as specific as a page of a magazine. Now, if remote viewing or telepathy or telekinesis was some kind of mental radar and energy which is beamed out and bounced back again, it wouldn't have the capacity to locate specific targets. Even something as simple as telepathically communicating with somebody involves the problem of finding the target. You don't need to telepathically communicate with someone in your line of sight. The person you're communicating with could be anywhere in the world. You may have no idea which direction they're in, and yet the so-called energy of telepathy can find the person. So this is a very different phenomenon from what physicists have defined as energy. It also seems to have a capacity to not be depleted. For example, in remote healing, people can do a lot of healing of someone else, of other people from a distance, but they're not depleted, they're not de-energized. Which suggests that maybe a better metaphor might be email. You can send out 1,000 emails, or 10,000, or 100,000 emails, and your computer isn't depleted. So maybe email and information rather than energy is a better metaphor for describing and articulating the phenomena that we find within parapsychology and with the megalithic circles. And so my suggestion is that what is conventionally now referred to as energy might actually be more usefully regarded as a form of consciousness. And people often say, well, it's just a metaphor, any metaphor will do. Well, no, metaphors can be very useful. Metaphors can suggest lines of research. For example, if it is an energy that's being used in paranormal phenomena, then it's probably some kind of wave function, in which case you'd expect certain phenomena to occur, certain resonances. But if it's a consciousness, then we would look at different ways of exploring it, different ways in which it can manifest. So my suggestion is that the Neolithic people regarded the world as a manifestation of consciousness and may have understood how to engineer, how to utilize consciousness for their benefits within shamanic work, and that they weren't burdened with either our modern notion of a material world or our notion of energy, and that perhaps we ought to free ourselves from thinking of the paranormal, thinking of ley lines as energy, and rethink it as a form of consciousness. And we might find ourselves going down the same way of thinking the Neolithic people used. So that's my suggestion as to what the temples might have been used for, what their worldview is. I don't know. It's very hard, as I said at the beginning, to gauge the views of the Neolithic people. But I think it's worth not locking ourselves into a fixed concept which is actually borrowed from modern technological science. Now, we're organizing a conference in Malta in November. I'll just say a few words at the end about this conference, which is aimed at trying to explore different aspects, different angles of megalithic temples, not just in Malta, but around the world, and including both academic archaeology and independent archaeology, esoterics, philosophy, psychology. It's in November. It's taking place in this building, which is it's called the Carafe of Stores. It was built in 1689. It was part of the Knights of St. John, who basically ran Malta for 350 years. It was their maritime headquarters. They used it for storing things for ships and the headquarters for their naval officers. And there'll be three main strands of the conference. One is a series of talks, presentations, but also experiential workshops, and also an art exhibition and musical performances. Now, the nearest that we can go in trying to recreate a sense of being in the Neolithic temple without using illegal substances is the trance dance. So on the first evening of the conference, we will have a group from New York called Body Temple, who will be organizing a blindfold trance dance to try to give people a sampler of what it's like to be in a state which you're removed from the visual immersion in this world. Caroline Malone and Simon Starlart from Cambridge University are the two people who did the excavation of the Brockdorf Circle, yielding a huge range of pieces of information, artifacts, and the database of the location of these items. And they'll be reporting on their results. Okay. And Paul Devereux will be there talking about archaeoacoustics. And hopefully, if we get access to the House of Leoni underground temple, be able to take measurements there and report on them. There's Mario Vassallo, who's done a lot of work on the alignments of stones within the megalithic temples in Malta. And he's done a lot of work on how they could have been built and designed just using poles and ropes to measure the position of the rising and setting sun without the use of any high technology or any magic. It's a useful way of demystifying the temples. I think it's important to demystify what can be demystified, but to respect the mystery of what is genuinely mysterious. Because that at one level, these people were just ordinary people who went about their lives farming the fields of Malta, and they used whatever came to hand to build the temples. I think if we can explain how they would construct the alignments using whatever came to hand, then we should do so. But would want to avoid the archaeological tendency to dismiss any mystical content or any sense of reality of a spiritual realm that they would have accessed. So I think it's important to demystify what can be demystified and reduced to the mundane, but also to respect what is genuinely outside of the human realm, outside of the mundane world. That if the Neolithic people really did have access to other spiritual realms and had an easy and comfortable access because they weren't laboring under the notion of a material world, then that really should be respected and included in our notion of what the temples were for. Benny Shannon will be talking about the entheogenic origins of religions. He's done some recent work in Israel looking at combinations of plants similar to ayahuasca, where two plants, when combined, have a psychotropic effect, and putting forward that as support of his theory that all religions originate in entheogens. There'll also be three art exhibitions, three artists exhibiting there, Anna Grima, who's done a lot of work in the temples. In fact, all three of them were part of a group who went into the underground temple of Halsaflieni before it was refurbished and reopened to the public. They allowed 6 artists to go in and just spend a few months painting or sculpting inside the underground temple while the workmen were still putting in the new floors so people can walk without damaging the fabric. Sadly, 2 of those 6 people have died since then. 3 of them will be at the exhibition, and the 4th one is lost somewhere in Germany. Also, Wendy Bartley, who made sound recordings within a number of the temples, will be performing a soundscape in which people can walk around the building and hear different recordings from within temples of found sounds, people talking about it, and also herself singing in the temple. And finally, Jennifer Berezan, who recorded an album in 1999 inside the underground temple of Halsaflieni, will be giving a concert. And that is it.
So, can we take any questions from the floor? Has anyone got any questions for Peter?
Yeah, hi. Just something came to mind when you mentioned the word portals, and it's just someone I know who works with opening stargates around the world, and I remember him mentioning Malta, where there's a portal there where by using the portal we're able to transport stones long distances just through. I was just wondering if you know anything about that, or it's maybe worth looking into.
Yeah, there is a one story about a possible portal, not in connection with moving stones, but people disappearing. In the Halsaflieni underground temple in 1940, a group of 30 school children went in, tied themselves together. This is long before it was actually open to the public, and went down into the deepest level. And there are a series of apertures which were used for storing bodies, one of which isn't blocked off at the end, but people go all the way through into whatever's beyond there. And all 30 children went through. And after the last one went in, the opening collapsed, and the rope was found to have been cut quite sharply. They were never found again. An English reporter came a few weeks later to visit the place and had permission to go down to look around. She went through the same aperture, which had been unblocked, with 2 other people tied to her. And what she found at the other end was a large chamber. And she saw on the ledge opposite her a series of beings covered from top to toe with hair, one of which raised its hand towards her. She felt a cold blast of air which blew out a candle, and then felt something slimy and wet rush past her. Obviously, she reversed back out of this narrow tunnel with her colleagues, who, when they saw her at the surface, saw how white her face was, realized something horrible had happened. And she came back a few weeks later again and found that the guide who was there at the time, the security officer, had also, no one knew about him. He'd vanished. So there is a suggestion that possibly there could be a portal, a connection to another realm inside that temple, which would tie in with the presence of cryptozoological entities, these Yeti-like beings. This was reported in the National Geographic magazine in August 1940. That's the only thing I know about in terms of a portal to other realms.
Any other questions?
Do you know anything about, you mentioned that the Knights Templars were in Malta for a long time. Do you believe they were attracted there either because of the energies or because of the ancient sacred sites?
Probably not. I mean, it's a nice notion, but they didn't actually want to come to Malta. They were kicked out of Rhodes, and they wanted to go somewhere in the mainland, but the only place they could get was Malta. Now, it's possible that maybe the universe steered them towards Malta because of its concentration of temples, but certainly the knights themselves, Knights of St. John, really didn't want to go there. Having arrived there, they made a very good job of defending it and building initially the citadel of Burgo, where this conference is, and then afterwards, after the siege in 1565, they built the city of Valletta. But initially, they were quite resistant to coming to Malta.
Question? Yeah.
Hi Peter, Ross Hemsworth, the Phantom or Fraud Project and Glastonbury Radio. I've been doing similar research to yourself on the energy lines, and I was interested to see that you mentioned about the energy lines being possibly consciousness lines. Now, we carried out a recent experiment on West Kennet Longbarrow on what's believed to be an energy line, which could in fact be a consciousness line, where when 2 people who were fairly good at ESP were scoring an average 3 out of 10 in normal psi tests, when we put them on that line, that went up to 7 out of 10 consistently. And I just wondered whether you've tried any of those sort of experiments with your own research.
No, I haven't tried any such experiments. I think that the whole question about energies and lines involves a conflation of what is physical with what is non-physical. What we experience as the conscious mind is not, I think, localized. If you open up someone's brain, you will see the brain tissue, but you won't see the conscious experience. It's a little bit like a radio broadcast or television broadcast being received by a television set. You have your little box, which you can see an image, but that image doesn't originate inside the box. It is coming from somewhere else. And so I favor the theory of the brain and the mind, in which the brain is a conduit, a material conduit of the conscious mind. It's a virtual physical conduit, but it's a conduit. I think the mind itself is inherently non-local. It's not localized anywhere in space. We think of each of our minds as being inside the head, and so we have lots of minds in this room. I think that's a mistaken concept, but in fact each mind is in a non-physical realm outside of space altogether. And this is how it is possible for things like telepathy and telekinesis to be able to operate without any distance effect. one of the few consistent findings in parapsychology is that there's no attenuation of telepathy or telekinesis with distance. The same success rate is achieved whether you're in the same room or thousands of miles away, which is indicative that these phenomena are actually operating purely within a non-physical, a non-spatial realm of consciousness. So when we talk about lines of consciousness, we're bringing consciousness back into the spatial world, the world of 3 dimensions of space, where I don't think it belongs. So the question of why certain places, certain artifacts have an effect on ESP, on these phenomena, I suspect isn't to do with the physical location, but with the materials there with which they are perceiving. There's a phenomenon called psychometry, in which people pick up an object such as a wristwatch and feel a connection with the person who owned it. I think that is a clue to how paranormal phenomena actually work. A little bit of a digression, but I think it's important to understand the concept. In the experiments in remote viewing that the CIA did for 25 years, they began by giving people geographic coordinates of where they wanted to use clairvoyance, use remote viewing. After a while, they realized that they don't actually need to give them the coordinates. They give them 6 random digits, and the remote viewing works equally well. And then they said, well, we don't need to give them numbers at all, just say target. And the remote viewer would find their way mentally to the target place, which might be in another country. Now that indicates that somehow the person doing the remote viewing is following a chain, is first of all accessing the mind of the supervisor of the remote viewing experiment, then using his own perceptions to trace back to the target. In other words, it's like sending a return of an email. If you receive an email, if there's a return address, you can send it back into the ether. They may hop through several different places and eventually locate where it came from. I think that is how these paranormal phenomena work. Now, in the case of the megalithic temples, I think those stones themselves have borne witness to so many ceremonies, so many intense experiences, that they will have a link to the spiritual realm. They can function as portals, not because of where they are in space, but because the consciousness inside those stones is itself acting as a bridge, acting as a facilitator to another realm of consciousness. So that would be my guess.
Hi. Matt and I spent some time in Malta a few years ago, and I thoroughly recommend these amazing places to anybody who gets a chance to go. What I wanted to ask you, though, was totally separate. What's your opinion on the cart tracks on top of the cliff that are supposedly as old or older than some of these temples?
Yeah, these are very small ruts of a few inches or maybe a foot deep, which are found in numerous places within Malta, and they're often not just 2 lines of them, as you might expect from the conventional archaeological explanation, which is that people are carrying heavy loads with 2 little sticks and it etched a way through. There are often hundreds of these ruts, and they often go through 90-degree turns. They'll go along and suddenly abruptly turn. So whatever they are, they're clearly not produced simply by dragging things along. And they're also not channels for water, because again, you wouldn't necessarily have abrupt turns, and you wouldn't have so many of them crisscrossing. It's one of the sites is referred to as Clapham Junction, because there's so many lines going along and crisscrossing. The one theory which I've heard, which has some plausibility, is that they were used for transporting the megalithic stones. People would pack wood into the ruts, coat it with olive oil so it's smooth for the stones to be dragged along. And then it wouldn't matter if there were abrupt 90-degree turns, because if you're pushing something along on top of the wood in the ruts, you could simply maneuver it along. So I don't know what the ruts are for, but that is the one plausible theory. They're also quite a useful indicator that Malta used to be rather bigger than it is now. Within St. George's Bay, these ruts go down to the coast and then re-emerge on the other side, clearly passing through the valley in between. which has since been submerged. And it supports the notion that parts of Malta were flooded. There may well be settlements and temples underneath the water. Graham Hancock included in his book and the Channel 4 documentary the claim that there is an underwater temple off the coast of Malta near Slima. Footage does indicate structures like arches and straight lines, which suggest that there was actually a temple there. And it's indirect support even for the notion that Malta was Atlantis, which is one theory in circulation.
I think we'll end it there if that's okay. Yeah, thank you.
This has been a Megalithomania audio production. For more information, visit megalithomania.co.uk.